This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions about software engineering topics at least once a month. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for supporting the podcast.
Okay, welcome listeners to another episode on Software Engineering Radio. Today we talk with Rini van Solingen about distributed Scrum. So welcome Rini.
Thank you, Martin.
Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, that's fine. My name is Rini. I'm a software engineer from my education. So I did computer science, then I did my PhD in management science. And now for some time I'm a professor in global software engineering at the Delft University of Technology. That's a part-time position, so for 1 day, 1.5 days a week. Besides that, I am working as a Scrum coach, distributed Scrum consultant, CTO at a company in the Netherlands, Scrum.nl.
Ah, cool. So we are going to talk about the distributed Scrum. Can you tell us or introduce us to what do you mean with exactly distributed Scrum?
Yeah, that's a good question, in fact, because in many cases you're on your research side, you're blinded by your terminology. And the nice thing is to say this that there's some research has been done in Sweden to, let's say, get something on the terms. I mean, everybody using some terms, so Darja Smitty and Klaas Wolin has led some research on that level to really define the terms. So with distributed in my research, I mean, let's say software engineers that are working together in a team while they're not on the same location. But of course, then the question is what's not the same location. But let's say if they are in the same building, you could call that co-located. And in this case, we would call it distributed or dislocated, meaning there is at least, I would say, substantial travel time to reach one side to the other. And when substantial, I would mean, it's more than half an hour, more than an hour drive.
Okay, so would you think that some kind of outsourcing and offshoring also belongs to some kind of distributed Scrum, or would you think it's a different thing?
Yeah, this is exactly. So when you talk about distributed development, normally people are talking about offshoring development, or in my case, my research is on global software engineering. So when people are distributed over continents, across time zones, thousands of kilometers. However, if you look at the research and some leading work has been done by Thomas Allen. He's in the building construction, but they did some empirical research, and in that they detected that in fact, and when people are more than 30 meters, just more than 30 meters apart from each other, the chance that they run into each other and have, let's say, unplanned interaction drops to a very low level. So meaning that when people are more than 30 meters apart from each other, it doesn't really matter whether it's 100 meters, it's 100 kilometers, or it's a couple of thousand kilometers. They don't meet each other anyway.
Okay. And you're also referring to distributed Scrum in the term of across companies or within one company but different locations. So you're having this kind of contracting between companies. Is that also a topic or not really?
Yeah, well, when we talk about distributed software engineering, we're just talking about the location. We're talking about the distance. If you would, let's say, Scrum, so if we move to the agile way of working, distributed Scrum would in my case be only the geographical conditions. But then of course you get other definitions that whether you do this stuff in-source or you outsource. So it could be that you say, well, we have outsourced distributed Scrum and we have in-house distributed Scrum.
Oh, okay, I see.
But the distribution is really a geographical term.
I see. All I know about Scrum is it's really invented and mostly suitable for one team sitting together in one office, maybe in one room. What do you think are the biggest pain points when working with distributed Scrum?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good thing to ask, especially because it start from which area do you start it with, and that's also, let's say, in the research community. I'm part of the International Conference on Global Software Engineering, the ICGZ.org, and also in that community you see, let's say, two flavors. And there are two kind of ways to look at it. So let's say half of people say, well, this Scrum and this Agile is exactly working very nicely in co-located teams that are interacting very frequently and work together, let's say, in an sort of structured way, but let's say not the communication is structured. And because of that, and when they're close to the business owner, they achieve incredible results and they achieve hyper productivity. So that part of the community says, well, you must be completely stupid to use an approach which, let's say, works very fine when you're co-located to apply that in a distributed location, because, well, you're abusing something which is intended for co-located in a distributed setting. That's half of the audience, of half of the people on the conference. The other half of the people saying, well, if we're talking about distributed development, the main problems coming from distance are communication, control, and coordination. Well, and if agile approaches are very strong in one thing, then it's arranging the communication, the control, and the coordination. So you use Scrum or you use agility or agile methods as a solution to a problem. And the problem is that distribution creates problems in communication, control, and coordination, and you try to fix that with an agile way of working. And when I give presentation, often I say, well, some small kids, the kids that are born, and small kids, they only look with one eye. They have two eyes, but one of these eyes they're not really using, so they are merely watching one-dimensional. And when they find it out, these kids see double, and they have problems with walking. What they do then, they take a bandage and they put it on the well-working eye. And because of that, they force the sick eye or the lazy eye, they force that eye to function as well. And in fact, that's a little bit what you do when you start working with Scrum in distributed development. So you're using an approach which, let's say, is really very strongly building on informal control and informal communication and coordination in a setting where that's exactly difficult. So, and that's the other half of the audience, and that's, let's say, more the part of the audience that I feel connected to. I see lots of advantages with using Scrum in a distributed setting, because Scrum is exactly solving those points which are weak in a distributed setting.
But how does it look like in practice? So in Scrum, you facilitate communication with a daily Scrum, for example, where all the people stand together and talk for 15 minutes to each other. I couldn't imagine that is easily possible in a distributed team, even with different time zones and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But let's say one of the starting points, of course, with Agile Scrum is let the team figure it out. Right? The team consists of smart, well-educated people that are pretty well able to find a way in which they get things working. So Scrum is, let's say, one of the rhythm is in fact the daily huddle, where you have the daily Scrum meeting, about 15 minutes, in which the team aligns their work, sets goals for the day, and makes sure that they are working on a good planning, and that the impediments get detected and get busted that same day. Well, of course, when you do this distributed, that's a challenge. The challenge is, well, when you do a co-located meeting, then it's very, very obvious that it works. So how do you get this working in a distributed setting? On the other hand, the meeting has a purpose. And because of that purpose, you solve a couple of problems. So the team will always find ways to deal with, for example, the daily stand-up. And what I see in distributed teams that are, let's say, distributed on long distances and time zones, what they most of the time do is they start or do their daily huddle, they do their daily Scrum at the start of the latest team members. So, for example, when you work with India, you see that, let's say, when it's 8:30 or 9 o'clock in Europe, that's the time for the daily huddle. That's when the complete team sits around or stands around, ideally, a screen with a Skype connection or some other kind of video conference. There they do the daily stand-up. What you see then besides of it, most of the time, is that, let's say, the team members that start the earliest, well, in the example, let's say the India team members, they still have the wish to align their work among themselves anyway. So what you then see, that you see a kind of small daily huddle occurring at the team that starts at first, and then the others join in, and then they have, let's say, the team huddle.
And what happens if the time zones are so widely distributed? Like, say, you have people in Japan, in India, in Europe, in North America, so that you don't don't be able to find an exact time spot where all the people can sit together?
Yeah, well, also for this is let the team figure it out. The daily stand-up is not there to just stand up. I mean, and if there's, let's say, a timing problem, or there's really, let's say, an infeasibility to really have everybody stand around and have a short meeting to line stuff, okay, well, then you have to find other ways of dealing with that. The main purpose of the daily huddle is to make sure that, let's say, everybody is aware of the status, everybody is clear what others are doing, and that there's, let's say, a daily heartbeat in which, let's say, problems are detected and impediments are busted. That's the purpose. And any team, how distributed it is over which kind of exotic time differences are, they're able to solve it in a way that fits them.
Okay, I see. But just one more question regarding communication here in this case. My observation is that if people are distributed, they tend to communicate less than if they are sitting together in one room, right?
Yes.
So it's happens more often that people talk to each other when they're sitting in front of each other than if you have to pick up a telephone or need a Skype call or whatever. So people tend to be a little bit lazy and getting lazy about this communication thing, and that is, I guess, something that you really would like to avoid.
Yeah.
How do you try to avoid this laziness in picking up the telephone or communicating with people who are working on a different time zone, maybe different language, different culture?
Okay. Let's say that I think there's two answers to your question. First of all, of course, is indeed, when people are distributed, they tend to communicate less frequently. So that's for one. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm so in favor of using agile methods, for example, and then in my case, most of the time it's Scrum, because everybody in the team is completely aware that if they don't communicate, Scrum will fail. Because agile methods rely and depend so heavily on informal and frequent communication that they completely fail when they don't. So let's say it's the number one risk. And while we are, let's say, as human beings, have complete difficulty in doing many things in parallel at the same time, we are all very good at focusing at the number one risk. And if you also look for yourself to your projects in the past, projects or encounters rarely fail because of the number one risk. Because the number one risk is that, let's say, there are all kind of actions, everybody's focusing on them, everybody's looking at them. So most of the time it doesn't fail over there. It always fails, or the problems always come from the number 3 or the number 4 risk. And that's the benefit of using, let's say, agility in distributed teams, that everybody is focusing on the number one risk. And the number one risk that if we don't act as a team, if we don't communicate, if we don't have, let's say, the frequent interaction, our way of working will fail, and we as a team will fail. So that's one part of the solution. So the fact that you use agility in distributed teams solves it already for a large extent. On the other hand, of course, still there is no real co-location. So you need to find ways, and tools can help in that way, but also, let's say, just habits can help in that, to make sure that this awareness of the distance goes down. And I think I will get better to that later. But let's say the key to distributed development is in awareness. So it's not the distance itself which is the problem, it's the perception of the distance. So it's not the fact that people are on the other side of the world working at the moment that's the problem. It's the problem that you have the feeling they are far away. So, and there's technology that can bring that closer. And of these new technologies, there's one I would like to pinpoint it and give specific focus to, which is an American startup company, which is called Sococo.com, SOCOCO. And I don't know whether you've heard about it, Martin, or whether you've seen it.
No.
Okay, well, Sococo is really fun to watch, because what they do, in fact, they provide a virtual office environment. And not three-dimensional like in Second Life or something. It's more two-dimensional. So it's a map of a company in which you see, let's say, a conference room with screens which you can share. There are private offices where you can work in. And the point is that if you have your headset on, and you have your microphone open, just as when you normally are working, so you listen to music anyway, so you have the headset on anyway. If you say something, the people in the room, so in the virtual room in Sococo, they will hear you. just like in a normal office environment. If you speak out, people in the same room will hear you, and in the adjacent room they won't. And the same goes in the Sokoko office. So you have, let's say, they create a kind of office awareness in which everybody can have their private office, or they can share the office in which they work. But still, if you speak out, people in the same room will hear you, and when they speak out, they will hear you, you will hear them. There are screens on the wall, team screens, where you can share information, where you can work on together. So this is an example of, let's say, a tooling environment which creates the perception of a low distance, and it creates the perception whether people are working in the same room. And for my university research, this is really interesting because, of course, from a factual perspective, we cannot solve distance. You know, there's 6,000 kilometers to the other side in India. I'm not able to solve that, but I can reduce the perception of that distance. So when people have, let's say, the feeling or the same level of awareness when they are dislocated, when they are co-located, we solve that. And Sokoko is an example of a solution to that. And at the moment we are running an experiment in the Netherlands with a company in which all people of the company, and they are a large distributed company, they all work together in Sokoko, and the first results are really promising. We are not solving everything, of course, that there is still some dislocation, but the perception of awareness reduces largely. So they have the feeling they are much closer when they are working in an environment like that.
What are your observations with these first experiments? What problems remain with that tool?
Well, it's most of the time it's not in the tool. It's how you look at it. For example, if I demonstrate it first time and people look at it and they say, yeah, well, but what can it do differently than, for example, Skype? Well, and that's not the question. I mean, you know, you shouldn't look at it from a functional perspective. You should look at it from, let's say, a perception perspective or from an awareness perspective. So let's say if it creates a perception of distance to which is closer than when you have it originally. So, but of course you should use the tooling, and that's the point of it. But you have this stuff, you can start it up automatically when your computer starts, and I'm very happy with it. For example, I have 2 PhD students which I work for, and I'm traveling around. I'm only at the university 1 day a week. I'm at customers, etc. But we have just a policy within our team, and the PhD students are also dislocated. They work at a company, they work in the university, and we have this internal policy. If you turn on your PC, Sokoko starts up automatically, and we have our own office space, so we are there. We can see that we're there. We can ask a question to each other when it's necessary. Sometimes it's just to say hi. How are you? How was your weekend? Or good night, I'm going home. Sometimes we don't talk at all during the day, but still we have the awareness and the perception that we're much closer than we're not, because else we would have to call and then you're interrupting, or you send an email and you have to wait for an answer. But because we're in an environment which, let's say, gives us the same kind of awareness as an office environment, the perception of distance and the feeling of distance reduces. And I think that's the main hurdle to take, and that's also, let's say, the main goal in our research at the University of Delft is what I call, let's say, create a virtual 30 meters. I mean, we have the Allen curve, we have the Allen distance of 30 meters, and of course we cannot fix the distance between software engineers, but we can reduce the perception of the distance. So when people are working dislocated, but they still have the feeling they are within 30 meters of each other, we have, let's say, solved a large part of the problem.
Would you also move the information radiators that are typically used in Scrum and, for example, the task board into such a tool?
Yeah, that's a nice question that you ask. I mean, the tools in Scrum, let's say, and you called it the radiators, but let's say the Scrum board, etc., they have a purpose. And the main purpose of a Scrum board is to have visual oversight and to visualize progress, to say to managers who want to know what the progress is. We're not going to send you a report, come in, look at the wall, and you see our progress. You see the tasks moving around, you see the burn down going down. So that's how we deal with progress, and that's the purpose. to facilitate communication among the team, that people interact. You see when working with Scrum that the Scrum board becomes, let's say, the center of communication, and that's the purpose. As soon as you start to work distributed, one of the first questions that comes up, which tool are we going to use? And don't misinterpret me. It's not that I'm against tools, but tools have the tendency to block communication. So when we are working, let's say, with 2 locations, I'd rather have a Scrum board in each location and Scrum masters that call each other 3-4 times a day to make sure that the Scrum boards are aligned. I prefer that over a tool in which, let's say, people are just sitting behind their desks, entering the data into the tool and block the communication. On the other hand, of course, it's also handy when you have a tool environment. So, but as long as everybody who's using the tool is very much aware that the tool is not there to record the data and the information, but the Scrum board or the tool is there to facilitate the interaction, then it's fine, and they use it for that. So what I often also see that they use a smart board. They use for example, Jira on a smart board, and then you have, let's say, the best of both. On the one hand, you have, let's say, the visualization where everybody can see it, and at the same time, it's easier to distribute to other locations because there's a database underneath which keeps it up to date. There's on YouTube, this is quite funny. I think it was in Denmark, but there's a group at Vodafone. So if you type in at YouTube Vodafone and an RFID Scrum board, they had an RFID Scrum board made themselves, which is connected to Jira. And let's say when you move the Scrum cards over the board, they update it automatically in the background in Jira. And when somebody behind their desk starts to alter Jira, then the Scrum board starts complaining that it's out of date because the cards are not hanging on the right positions. It's a bit nerdy, but quite funny. They have a nice movie on YouTube on it where you can really actually see the sprint progressing on that board.
Cool. Sounds funny.
Yeah.
We should put the link on the show notes.
Yeah, typical pet project, for example, for FedEx Day or something, which is something fun to make over the weekend. And
I also saw teams who are distributed. They are trying to use actually the distribution to benefit from it in terms of, let's say, following this kind of Conways Law, where you have, if you have distributed teams, you will get a distributed system. Or when you have 4 teams, let them build a compiler, you will get a 4-pass compiler. For example, the Eclipse team, they're using the distribution nicely to to strengthen the module boundaries at the exact same points where the teams are distributed.
Okay.
So that we have a module boundary, and this should be a good API between module boundaries. Then we put the 2 teams working on the client and the producer side of this module boundary into different locations, so that there is some kind of communication going on, but less than if they're on site. What do you think of this way of using the distribution to build the system?
Yeah. Let me give you 2 replies. First one is, of course, is that maybe not everybody in the audience understands Conways Law, but Conways Law says something like the architecture of a system reflects the organization that created it. Meaning, so when you have a system with which is built and you organize yourself with 3 departments, you will most of the time see the 3 departments back in the architecture of the system.
Right.
Exactly. Well, first of all, it's called Conways Law. But first time I encountered it, I did some research on it. Well, it's a hypothesis. It's not a law. I mean, there's hardly any evidence of this law. At least I haven't seen it. But anyway, it's logical. It seems logical that when you distribute groups and they try to not interact as much as possible, that you will see that reflected in the system. So that seems logical. And also when you work with, let's say, an outsourcing partner, and then it seems logical that you will somehow find that back in the architecture of the system, because indeed you would like to fix an interface and develop parallel to it and then do the integration. I think there's 2 ways to reflect on that. First of all, architecture should serve you, and it should not serve development teams. An architecture should serve the end user. It should you build software to create business value. The architecture is also serving that business value, delighting customers, responding to change fast, and making sure, let's say, the systems we create develop business value when they are being used. And it can be to create money, but it can also save people's lives, provide energy, protect the environment, etc., etc. So value is not necessarily economic value. So that's one thing. So architecture should serve that. It should not serve development teams. I mean, so if you, let's say, have teams that work together, and let's say just for a matter of easiness or to make it easier on themselves, construct an architecture, they're making a basic flaw. Architecture is not there to serve the teams. Architecture is there to serve the end user. That's the first response. So that's why I'm also very much in favor of let's say, the way agile teams deal with architecture, by letting it emerge from the most valuable user stories. Because the most valuable user stories you take at first, they can be much more dominant to the architecture. So then the architecture emerges from that, and not, let's say, from teams that say, well, it's easier for us to work together. Second thing is, of course, that when you work in a way like that, you are postponing integration, and with the risk of pulling feedback to a later point in time. And the third thing is, of course, I don't know how much software you have developed, Martin, but it's always when things need to be changed, it's always easier to request a change from the other than from yourself. And that's always the problem. Then when it's teams, you get an us versus them. We want you to change something. No, we cannot. You have to change, etc. While that doesn't serve the end user either. So that's one part of the exam of the answer, is that when constructing teams, please make sure, let's say, that they are, let's say, not serving the teams, but they're serving the architecture for the system. That's the first part of the question. So, and the second part of the answer is that if we look at the research on agile teams and on distributed agile teams, you can also look at the work of Guido Schoonheim, Jeff Sutherland, who did something on fully distributed Scrum. You can find it there. Is that one of the advantages we see is that you put difficult issues within the team. So it's an interface. It could not be a technical interface, but also the distance interface, for example, put that in the team. So when you have, for example, 2 Scrum teams, you have 8 people on one location and 8 people on the other location, which is 16 in total. That would mean 2 Scrum teams. So the easiest way is say, well, okay, then we have Scrum Team A on location A and Scrum Team B on location B. And that's easy. These people can work co-located, they can interact with each other, and in the end we do the integration. That's a way to solve that. Well, if we look at the way that's been doing in practice and the evidence that's there, it indicates that that's not a very good solution, because then there's a low level of interaction between the teams, maybe even some time distance, etc. So there will be some inter-team problems. If you, let's say, are able to construct it that the teams do not have to work together at all, okay, well, that's then of course fine, but most of the time it's not. When you have two Scrum teams working on the same system, they need each other. So then the best practice is to make sure that the teams are distributed. So when you have then 8 people on one location, 8 on the other, you could create 2 teams with each, let's say, 4 people on one location and 4 people on the other location, because then you bring the distance within the team. And when you put the distance in the team, people will work together. And they are trying to solve problems because, let's say, they are dealing with the total problem and not with the solution on the other side. So that's the same thing when you would do the same thing with a technical system. It would make much more sense to bring also the technical challenges within the team. So bring them within the team in which they deal with that, instead of fixing them. Because if then things change, you have the team structure there, and you're not able to change that.
So I see that you really try to not avoid those communication problems, but to face them and try to solve them within the team, right?
I think that's the core of Scrum. The core of Scrum is not doing Scrum or doing Agile or having these meetings, etc. The core of Scrum is moving towards hyperproductivity, and the only way you can create hyperproductivity and high value creation in a team is by structurally taking impediments out. So you take the number one impediment, which slows you down, solve that, and then promote the number two impediment to the number one, and that you put on top of your list and you solve that. So that's the only way of really improving continuously and really creating progress. So that's not a problem. Impediments are not a problem. It's not by hiding problems. You should, let's say, put them out in the open and solve them. One of my favorite remarks is that Scrum is like your mother-in-law. She comes into your house, she finally points out all the stuff and all the things that are not okay, but then doesn't do anything to solve them. And that's what Scrum is. So it helps you to detect impediments, but then you have to solve them yourselves. So also within when you have, let's say, distributed teams working together, there is problems. Distributed work is very hard. It's much easier. The best way to develop systems is have the problem owner or the business owner who wants the system in the same room with a small team of cross-functional skilled developers solving this problem as soon as possible with an agile approach in which they take the most valuable user story first, get that done, get that into use, create value with that, and then move on. That's the most powerful way of working. As soon as you start distributing, you create problems with communication, control, and coordination. Those are impediments, and those you need to solve. So as soon as you bring this distance within the team, it will be one of their main impediments, and they will solve it because they need it to solve it to get better.
I think you was referring to this role in Scrum of the product owner, where the developers are getting back to them and asking questions and things like that. So typically in Scrum you have this kind of, you should have this kind of one product owner, or at least this one voice to the team, telling him what is important and explaining questions. How would you deal with that in a distributed team? So where typically maybe the product owner is just maybe located in one location and not the other one? Or would you have a product owner in each location? Or what is your preferred way of dealing with that?
Well, first of all, there's a few basic rules. And one of the rules is you should never forget one team, one backlog, one product owner. So as soon as you start to distribute people over the team, and the team is on two locations, it still holds one team, one backlog, one product owner. So that's the one thing you should never break up. And you see in many cases solutions popping up, and I don't mind. It's up to the team. The team will find a way of working, and I think that's the main thing that counts. So I'm not the one who's saying this is a good solution, that's a bad solution. The team should figure it out. The one thing what you sometimes see is that they call this product owner proxy or Scrum Master proxy. And it might solve some of the issues, but it also has a danger in it because there is only one product owner. So if, let's say, this proxy product owner really understands his or her role, is able to align with the real product owner on a daily basis or maybe a couple of times a day to make sure that they are still on the same track and on the same line, I think that could be a good way to solve it. On the other hand, I mean, the product owner is called product owner. This owner thing is there. And I mean, any product owner who is responsible and is passionate about what he or she is doing is always able to help a team to solve their problems. And it doesn't matter of the location. I mean, I've been a product owner myself for a couple of years. I was traveling around, and there was just a deal with the team. Of course, I was attending the meetings, but in the sprint, if they needed me, the Scrum Master would call. I would answer my phone. Independent of where I was, what time it was, I would answer my phone because the team can never wait for the product owner. And of course, when they start calling me every 5 minutes in the middle of the night, we will think of some kind of solution. But let's solve that problem. Then that problem will pop up in the retrospective anyway. We needed a product owner all the time in the midst of the night. And then we deal with that and we solve that. Instead of avoiding problems, putting a product owner proxy with a big risk that there's no alignment with the real product owner, and then at the end of the sprint or in some other time point of time, product owner will see something which is not in line with the expectations. So you're postponing feedback, and postponing feedback is always a major impediment. That's what we do agile for. Postponing feedback always shoots you in the back. It always comes back to you at a point of time where you don't need it. So It's not that I say you cannot have product owner proxies or solve something on a location, but the big danger is there that you're postponing feedback. So I'd rather have a product owner, a single one, on a location. So then distribute the team, maybe put 2 developers of the team close to the product owner and put the other part of the team on the other location, something like that, but make sure that the team really understand what the product owner wants. So keep the distance between product owner and team as close as possible. That would be my main answer.
I would like to ask you another question about distributed teams. What happens if you start with a distributed team? Typically, if you start with a Scrum team, you have some kind of team building and people will figure it out themselves. If you have a distributed team, it sounds to me a lot more difficult and a lot easier if people see each other in person than if they don't see each other in person all the time.
Completely right. One of the best practices in distributed Scrum is built around, teams are not created by themselves. I mean, team building teams takes time, takes effort, and it needs people to see each other. One of the directors of a company that I work with very frequently always says, you have to be drunk once on one single location together before you are a team. and there's some truth in it. I mean, being a team is standing out for each other, be willing to confront each other, having trust in each other. A great book to refer that I worked to is the work of Patrick Lencioni, who wrote this management book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which he really shows a pyramid of 5 levels of team building and 5 levels to really create a team. And it all starts with trust. If there's no trust, you don't have a team. And if anybody who has been in a sports team or in a social team or whatever team or a development team knows that if there's no trust, you're not a team. And building trust over long distances with Skype is of course much harder than to do it on a single location. But I think that's one of the wrong or one of the fallacies of our field when we talk about distributed development is that when we do co-located development, people interact with each other all the time. They have meetings, they have ad hoc meetings, they go for lunch, they have evening chats, they go cooking together, they do all these kind of things together. But when we start distributing them, there's some kind of assumption we should never meet. And of course, that's stupid. Of course you need to meet. The problem is there's a distance between it, so you need to plan it more carefully, etc. But still, I think, within a team, when it's distributed and you look to each individual, they somewhere between 10 and 20% of their time, they are still on the other location or interacting with other people on that location. And also when I would start a Scrum team, which it needs to be working distributed, or at the company where I work for, when we start with a new team or a new client where we create these distributed teams, it's very easy. First 2 sprints, 1 location. We set the people together, and it can be that the people from the Netherlands move to India or vice versa. But let's say building a team and getting working practices together and making sure that you can rely on each other, that you trust on each other, that you keep each other accountable is much easier to build up in a co-located setting. But nobody says that you cannot do that. Nobody says when you have a distributed team, you have to be distributed all the time.
Would you also recommend to do this kind of face-to-face meeting on a regular basis?
Yes, definitely. That's what I said. I think if you would look to the calendar of individuals in a software team, and I think that between 10 or 20% of the time they should be on the location as close to the product owner as possible.
Oh, okay.
That's let's say the ballpark figure, and that's often overlooked. When people start to make business cases for especially for offshore development, they're only looking at cost. Well, that's stupid. I mean, we are not in our field to reduce cost. We are building software to create revenues. We're there for the profits and we're there for the benefits and for the revenues, not for the cost. And when there's taking a look at offshore, we're just making this very ballpark figure kind of comparison. So we have here in our location, we have a team of 20 and they cost so much. So when we have the same team of 20 on an offshore location, it's much cheaper. Well, that's a simplification of our field, which really will come back at you. It will create much problems because it's not the cost, it's the value that's coming from it. So if you distribute teams and you work co-located or you work in an offshore setting, you should do it for the proper reasons. And cost should never be the one. So People traveling from one location to the other should be a fact. The fact that people from one side visit the other and work with them should be a fact. And it should never be in the business case when you go to work offshore that you try to reduce costs on traveling, or that you try to reduce cost on team building, or you try to reduce cost on people seeing each other. People need to see each other to really work together. And when they have done 20 projects together, they have seen each other many, many times. They have been drunk many, many, many times. Maybe the need to see each other goes down. But it's in that order. It's not the fact that you say, well, we have this great team that's working on our location with 10 people and they're working great together. Let's offshore that team and then expect that within 1 week they are on the same level as the co-located team.
What about different cultures? Do you have experience with distributed teams that are distributed across completely different cultures?
Okay. Well, culture is a separate topic. I mean, there's a lot of work done on that. I'm at a technical university, so I'm not trying to repeat social studies. One way we can deal with is the work of Hofstede, where he used these 5 dimensions of culture. That's a way to deal with it. But the one thing I would like to say, well, there's culture is a nice label. I mean, but culture is not that clearly defined and always present. It's a distribution. You have people that are outspoken in India. You have people that are never say yes or no in the Netherlands as well. So it really depends. You have national culture, but also you have a company culture. And there's some evidence that the company culture is much more dominant than the national culture. And you even have a professional culture within the profession, which is more dominant than the company culture. I mean, culture is all about norms and about values. Things you think are normal, or things that are proper, and things are improper, and things are good and bad. That's the norm and the value system. And within a professional culture like software engineering, there's a much more dominant culture of what's good practice and what's bad practice, or what's good software, what's bad software, which is much more dominant than the national culture where somebody comes from. The only point is, culture is the best excuse. I mean, if you are putting people in a cross-cultural setting, of course, there will be some experiences with that. And there will be some expectations which seem to be false. If you're working with people in Asia who think it's more important to be polite than it is to be honest, you should calculate with that. You should know it. And if you don't deal with it properly, then you might get some surprises. But culture, in my experience, is the best excuse for your own failure. So if you don't arrange yourself, if you don't train people, or if you don't, let's say, try to create a team, and if you don't try to align goals of the team, and things fail, then you didn't do your work. So what do you do then? Well, then it's easy. You blame it on the culture because that's not your fault.
So we talked a lot about this kind of distribution and how to get rid of the problems doing distribution. Sometimes you could get the impression that you should avoid distributed development at all to overcome all the problems. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's also feasible and usable for some kind of projects?
Okay, yes. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Well, of course, when you start working distributed, you introduce some problems that come forward from the distance. So if you don't need to do it, I would say don't do it. But there's, of course, very good reasons to think about distributed work or offshoring. And one of the things, the main reasons are the capacity. So the fact that you can get much more people and expertise and well-educated people on your projects or on your working than you get locally. That's the main reason, I think, to go for distributed development. Second thing would be that you have a worldwide presence. You like to be close to your customers. So when you have, let's say, customers distributed over the world, it makes sense to also to be close to your customers and also have some development effort and people close to your customers. And the third thing is time differences. Although time differences are, let's say, have some problems with it, they also have advantages. I mean, you can do 24 hours of work. You have the work of Carmel on Follow the Sun software development, where, let's say, people pass their work on to people in the new time zone that are starting their day, and they're passing on work all over the globe, so that there's 24 hours of development work instead of only 8. Also, you have companies that give guarantees. If you submit your bugs or your issues today, we have solved them by 9 tomorrow morning, because they have the people in a different time zone that are working while you are sleeping. So I think those are the main reasons. And but let's say I would say that the number one reason to consider distributed development is the availability of good educated people. And to give you an example, in the Netherlands, there's a very large shortage of educated people. One of our customers even won a prize for the best um, people employment ad in the newspaper. So they like to have some more people, and they had an ad in the newspaper, and they won a prize for it. They get no letters of applications to it, but that was on the site. Well, if we look to, we have a site in India here at Scrum.nl, and we get, let's say, between 50 and 100 application letters per day.
Oh,
It
wow.
doesn't mean we hire everybody, but we have, let's say, every day we invite 8 software engineers to talk to us and to see who they are and whether they would fit our company. We don't hire them all. There are good people in it. There are people that say would not fit our company culture. But still, it's a luxurious position to be able to choose the people that work for you instead of being happy that there's one people applying for a job. And I think that's the main reason. If you like to solve the challenges of tomorrow, and if you would really like to free the value which is there in IT systems and in software products, you need good people to build them, and they're much easier to find and to hire in offshore locations than they are in here.
I see. There is a book you wrote. It's called The Power of Scrum, and it's not a typical Scrum book because it's a novel.
Yes.
Why did you decide to write a novel instead of this kind of typical Scrum book explaining what
Okay.
Scrum is?
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. We wrote a book, The Power of Scrum, together with Jeff Sutherland and Elke Rustenberg. And indeed, it's a novel. It's a kind of management fable. It tells a story about a CTO who misses his flight. He has a project in problems, major customer, and then he comes in contact with Scrum and he doesn't understand it. And he thinks, well, there's nothing for me, and etc. Well, the main reason I did it, that the first deployment of Scrum that I did in the past was in a company where I was CTO. I was head of development. I was controlling all the developers, and they were all on one location, and they worked with this big waterfall planning of 1 year release, which then of course always become 1.5 years, etc., etc. So I did a Scrum deployment over there, but I could do it because in the management board where I was sitting, I just said to all my colleagues from sales, marketing, the CEO, I said, leave me alone. I have seen this before. I know how it works. Just give it the time, and I will prove you within 6 months that it will work. And well, we have the tradition in that company that they used 1 year planning, and most of the time it became 1.5 year. Stuff was thrown away mid-time, a vision changed, etc. And what I did, we just introduced Scrum with monthly sprints and 6 month iterations. And the first release, so 6 month releases, and the first release was, let's say, 2 weeks late because of two major bugs, and the second release was 2 days late because of a single bug. So I mean, I could prove it to them immediately that we were able to create value, that we would be able to release on time. Also, in this first release, when we were using Scrum, we tear down a complete list of issues from the help desk, from the sales, all kinds of questions that they could not get answered in the past years. We solved them within 6 months. So I showed value in this management team, very, very transparent, very easily. I presented them the backlog. They could give me input, etc. So, but I could do it because I was in charge, and I really understood that when I left the company, that not many people are when they encounter Scrum, especially when you're a developer or a project manager or a team lead, are able to make that change, and you have to convince your manager. But how do you convince your manager? Because he doesn't read these big, thick books for software engineers, and because it's full of technical issues, and he doesn't really understand it, etc. So I thought, well, I should have something that you can read on a plane, which is a book which you also, when you just browse it through, you can get the main message and you get the understanding. And that's when I came up with the idea of a novel. And then of course Jeff and Ilko also joined in, working on that, and that it became a story which you can read in 2 to 3 hours on a plane. When you fly across the Atlantic or something, and then you can understand the complete idea behind Scrum on a a story way, so it's a low threshold to start to understand it. And there are streamers in the book with these quotes which give you the main messages. It has a one-page summary at the end of each chapter, and it even has a one-page summary of Scrum on the end of the book. So even a manager who has only 5 to 10 minutes time will understand the core concepts of Scrum, and that helps developers, to sell them, because they tend to talk about, let's say, the mechanics. They tend to talk to the manager about, the planning meeting. We need a product owner, and then this manager says, "What all this terminology, all these changes? That's much too difficult." But if you, let's say, put it down to basics, you say, well, what would you like if we would be never late? And how would you like it when we always deliver the highest value first? Or how would you like it when there's a change coming from the field that we're able to deal with that within 2 weeks? That always convinces management, and that's the story what we should tell. And that's, let's say, in the Power of Scrum of the book, is an approach for a management level. And of course, it's also good because of that for software engineers to understand what it is, but really to convince a management level where the Power of Scrum is.
Yeah, sounds really good. And it's also translated into many languages, right?
Yeah. We originally brought it out in Dutch. It's about a year ago. We brought it out in Dutch. We have a forward by Jeff. That has sold something like 10,000 copies at the moment, which is really huge. We are a small country.
Wow.
We've only with 60 million people, so I think the software engineering population. I'm not sure about the figures, but let's say that's somewhere between 100 and 200,000 or something. I would estimate. We sold 10,000 of the book, and it's now also out in Germany by Henning Wolf. He made the German edit, and Guillaume Baudet made the French edit in France. And now for the international version, the English version, Jeff Sutherland did the major rewrite of the book. And I must say that it's especially the novelish character of the book is so largely improved that I'm really proud of what it is. And in fact, I'm tempted to rewrite the Dutch version again based on the English version, the way it's changed and the way it's made better.
Ah, cool. Sounds really good.
Yeah, and actually, it's even nice to tell you maybe that we even taped a professional movie about it together with Jeff, which is
wow.
which is a Scrum Master movie. It's a kind of movie that you say, well, this is very big guy Scrum Master who punishes everybody who violates the Scrum rules. But I will put a link together with the podcast, and people can look. It's a 3-4 funny movie and Jeff is even playing a major part in the book, in the movie.
Great, I'm looking forward to seeing it. Cool. So I think we covered most of our topics. Do you think you have any other pearls of wisdom you would like to share with our listeners at the end of this episode?
Well, I think we've talked about distributed development. We talked about distributed Scrum. We talked about, let's say, some of the mechanics or the problems to overcome. I think, let's say, and we addressed it merely in the talk already, but I think the key change or the key answer is in perception. And we're technical people. We like to think about solutions. That's always when we are in meetings with software engineers or software engineering managers. We are discussing solutions, but we're hardly discussing the problem. So let alone the problem behind the problem. And I think most of the challenges in distributed software engineering or distributed Scrum are caused by distance and by the effects of the distance. But distance is, let's say, a physical thing. But this is not the physical distance or the language distance, it's the perception of it. And if we look to the research and look at the work that we can be doing, you have a large influence in the perception of distance. You can have a large impact on the presence awareness of people that are working together. So I think that the answer for distributed development and distributed Scrum really lies in perception of distance, and all kinds of tooling and all kinds of solutions and attitudes and training can be thought of and are currently available that can help really influence that perception. Because if the perception of distance is beyond the leaders, distance is no longer a problem. And that's why I'm also such a fan and promoting, and that's why I'm really researching the effectiveness of Sokoko, is because that is exactly within the field. That is the main vision is that we have is when we reduce the perception of distance, we are solving the major problem in distributed and in global software engineering.
Great. Rini, thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Thank you for asking me to join you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, and hope to see you next time soon.
Okay, fine, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. SE Radio is an educational program brought to you by Hillside Europe. If you want more information about the podcast and the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example, by clicking on the Dig, Reddit, Delicious and Slashdot buttons, or by talking about us on Twitter and Facebook. You can also support us by joining the team and shouldering some of the work. To contact the team, please send email to team@se-radio.net. Or, if your feedback is specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can react to your comments. This episode of SE Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under a Creative Commons 2.5 license. Please see the website for details.